This was once a sensation. The supernatural incident of the execution ground in Dongguan, Guangdong Province, China, may exceed your understanding. It happened in Dongguan, Guangdong in the 1980s. At that time, the execution ground in Dongguan was around Huaguo Mountain. One night, Li Zongping hurried out of the house with an oil lamp. His cow was lost and he wanted to go into the mountain to find it. At that time, Niu could marry a daughter-in-law, even if it was already dark. Li Zongping hurried into the mountain to find it. Fortunately, the moonlight was very bright that day. After he entered the mountain with a kerosene lamp, it was not difficult to walk. Unexpectedly, Li Zongping stayed in the mountains for a long time. The kerosene lamps were burned out, and he still couldn't find his own cattle. In desperation, he had to drag his tired body home and wanted to go to the mountain to have a look tomorrow morning. The execution ground was the only way to return to the village from the mountain. As soon as Li Zongping went down the mountain, he found a group of people gathered not far ahead. Those people stood neatly at the other end of the square and stood in a row, about 6 or 7. In front of them, there is a man who is obviously much taller than them, dressed in white, which looks very obvious at night. Li Zongping asked very much, why a group of people gathered in the square in the middle of the night. He wanted to have a look, but he was suddenly attracted by a sound of zixozo. He turned his head and looked at that not far from him. There were several young backs. What was the cat looking for on the ground with its waist? Li Zongping was also enthusiastic. Seeing that they seemed to have lost something like himself, he asked them what they were looking for. He went there to hold his hand, but the man said that he was looking for eyes. Li Zongping thought he had misheard it and hurriedly asked again, but the man's answer made him even more stunned. The gun executed 2 days ago blew my eyes away. After listening to this, Li Zongping thought which bad boy in the village joked with him, but when he stepped forward and looked at the man's face through the moonlight, there was a blank in his mind. As the man said, there was a big hole in his head, as if he had been penetrated by something, even with an eyeball. At this time, Li Zongping didn't understand. The person looking for something in front of him was not a living person at all. When he was stared at that cold eyes, Li Zongping was so scared that he suddenly collapsed to the ground and shouted, there was a ghost. He straightened up again. The ghost had already pestle in front of him. At the same time, Li Zongping's cry seemed to alarm the figures not far away. They all turned around and came towards Li Zongping. After Li Zongping saw it clearly, his blood was cold all over. Obviously, these were all death row prisoners who were shot on the execution ground, facing ferocious and horrible faces. How could Li Zongping be shocked? He fell into a coma. Before he fell into a coma, he was confused and heard a low and ethereal sound in his ear. The voice seemed to have some magic. Li Zongping, who was originally unconscious, actually got up in a vague. Then somehow he followed the ghosts and walked slowly in one direction. Li Zongping vaguely saw the leader in front of him, as if he was impermanent, while in front of him was a dark path that did not know where to go. Li Zongping didn't know why he was following these ghost teams, let alone that he was going. In the muddle-headedness, he also wanted to get rid of the team, but his body did not listen at all. In this way, under the leadership of the kid, he walked along the grey path. I don't know how long he walked. Suddenly, he heard a harsh sound of horns behind him. This sound faded Li Zongping's confused feeling. He subconsciously looked back and saw that he had been looking for a cattle for half a night and stood not far behind him. A cow stared at him. Then he looked up and made another harsh cry. Li Zongping, who was originally muddle-noid, suddenly woke up by the sound of horns, and his dull eyes completely regained his senses. At this time, looking around, he was in a mountain forest, looking at himself looking for the cow all night. Li Zongping was stunned. Suddenly, he remembered the horrible scene that had just happened. He turned around in horror, but found that there were also mountains and forests behind him. The ghosts and impermanence just now had long disappeared. Li Zongping was finally relieved. At the same time, I only felt a burst of soreness all over and secretly congratulated myself. If it hadn't been for my own cattle, I might have followed those terrible ghosts. With a sigh of relaxation, he drove the cow home, which was also spread in the village. Li Zongping finally understood why he encountered such an evil thing. It turned out that the country severely cracked down on the mafia. 7 days ago, a large number of the most vicious criminals were executed at the execution ground in Dongguan. At that time, Lao Li didn't go to see the cattle, and many people in the village went to watch. A total of 7 or 8 criminals were shot, according to local accounts, on the execution ground. In the first 7 days after a large number of prisoners are executed, ghosts will come to arrest these wandering ghosts who can't be reincarnated. In order to find the lost cow, Li Zongping accidentally bumped into these ghosts.